How did you prove your dad wrong? What the hell is this? My dad slammed my report card on the kitchen counter, his face red with rage. Those are my grades? I said, confused since they were all excellent. Theater? Choir? He spat the words like they tasted bad. What kind of pussy takes choir? You quit football for this fairy bullcrap? He crumpled the report card and threw it at me. No son of mine is going to prance around on stage. You need to stop acting soft and be a real man for once. Man up or get out of my house. I picked up the crumpled paper and smoothed it out slowly. You want a real man? I said, looking him in the eye. You got it. The next morning, I refused to shower because hygiene was feminine. By day 3, Dad had to drive me to school with all windows down, gagging from the smell. When his co-workers complained to HR about the stench on his clothes, his boss asked if everything was okay at home. It's fine, Dad said through gritted teeth when he got home. But maybe just use deodorant. Real men don't mask their natural musk, I grunted. You said stop being weak. His jaw clenched, but he wouldn't take it back. Just keep your arms down at school. Clearly, that wasn't going to be enough to break him, so I escalated. I started trying to settle every disagreement with violence because real men fought for dominance. When the mailman accidentally gave us the wrong package, I challenged him to combat on our front lawn. The neighbors called the cops while Dad had to explain why his son was wrestling a federal employee. The mail stopped coming to our house entirely. Why would you do that? Dad screamed, his face purple with embarrassment. Real men defend their territory, I said. Unless you think I should be soft about it? He couldn't bring himself to say yes, just stormed off muttering about boundaries. I stopped showing any emotions except anger because real men didn't have feelings. When Mom called crying that Grandpa was in the hospital, I just grunted and hung up. Dad had to call her back and explain, and I heard her screaming at him through the phone about what he'd done to me. Obviously, I texted her afterwards to see how Grandpa was doing and if she was okay, but she was more focused on telling me what an asshole my father was. Your mother thinks this is my fault, he said the next day, looking exhausted. Caring what women think is feminine behavior, I responded, and watched him die inside because he couldn't argue without admitting he'd been wrong. Then I started bringing roadkill home as trophies because real men were hunters. Dead possums on the porch, raccoons in the garage, a deer head I found and mounted on my bedroom wall using construction adhesive. His girlfriend threw up when she found me skinning a squirrel in the kitchen sink with her expensive knives. He's lost his mind, she screamed at Dad. He's just being masculine, Dad said weakly, but she left anyway and told everyone he was raising a psychopath. So that was the end of his love life. When teachers called about my plummeting grades because I'd stopped doing homework, real men didn't need books. Dad tried to defend it. At least he's not in theater anymore, he told the principal desperately. But when I got suspended for challenging my math teacher to single combat over a grade dispute, Dad had to take time off work to deal with it. Please, just be normal at school, he begged. You said normal was for sissies, I reminded him. Are you going back on your word like a weak man? He couldn't say yes. His stubborn pride wouldn't let him, even as his life crumbled. I showed up to his office wearing a loincloth made from deer hide, carrying a spear I'd fashioned, demanding to challenge his boss for pack leadership. Security escorted me out while Dad got suspended pending psychological evaluation. His co-workers wouldn't stop talking about it for weeks. Please stop, Dad finally begged that night, actually crying. I was wrong, okay? Take theater, join choir, I don't care anymore. But you said real men don't admit they're wrong, I grunted. Are you being soft now? His face went red with rage even through the tears. I'm still your father. A real man would fight me for dominance, I said, chest thumping. Unless you're too weak? Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. 2 people in suits holding clipboards with Child Protective Services badges stood outside. We've had multiple reports about forced primitive living conditions, the woman said, looking at my loincloth and spear with alarm. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't supposed to happen. I looked at Dad, expecting him to explain, but his expression had changed to something calculating. Thank God you're here, he said suddenly. I've been trying to get him help, but he won't stop this behavior. It's been terrifying. My mouth fell open as I realized he was throwing me under the bus completely. The male caseworker stepped forward and held out his badge for us to see properly. I'm Theo Montgomery from Child Protective Services, and this is my colleague. We need to speak with both of you about the living situation here. His voice stayed calm and professional, while Dad's face transformed right in front of me. The rage melted away and got replaced with this worried, tired expression that looked almost real. Please, come in, Dad said, his voice shaking just enough to sound concerned instead of angry. I've been so worried about him. This behavior started a few weeks ago and I don't know what to do anymore. I stared at him while my brain tried to catch up with what was happening. Theo's partner pulled out a tablet and started typing notes, while Theo looked between us. Can you describe what you've observed? Theo asked Dad, and I watched my father lie through his teeth. He just suddenly stopped showering, started acting violent, bringing dead animals into the house, Dad said, running his hand through his hair like he was exhausted. I tried to get him to see a doctor, but he refused. I've been terrified he's going to hurt himself or someone else. The words came out smooth and practiced, like he'd been planning this speech. He showed up at my workplace yesterday wearing animal skins and carrying a weapon, demanding to fight my boss. Security had to remove him. I think he's having some kind of mental breakdown. Theo wrote everything down while I stood there in my deer hide loincloth holding a homemade spear, which honestly didn't help my case. I see, Theo said carefully. And when did this begin? Dad shook his head sadly. Just out of nowhere about 2 weeks ago. He was a normal kid, played football, got good grades, then suddenly this. I opened my mouth to argue, but Theo held up his hand. I'd like to speak with each of you separately if that's okay. We need to get everyone's perspective. Dad nodded eagerly. Of course, whatever helps. I just want my son to get the help he needs. The way he said it made me want to scream. Theo asked me to show him my room while his partner stayed with Dad in the living room. I led him down the hallway, aware of how ridiculous I looked and smelled. He didn't comment on either thing, just followed me and closed the door behind us. Can you sit down for me? He asked, gesturing to my bed. I sat while he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of everything. The spear leaning in the corner. The raccoon head mounted on my wall with construction glue still visible. The pile of unwashed clothes in the corner that probably had visible stink lines. He documented it all methodically while I sat there feeling my stomach twist. Okay, he said finally, putting his phone away and sitting in my desk chair. I want to hear your side of what's been going on. Start from the beginning. So I told him everything. About the report card and Dad calling theater and choir fairy bullcrap. About him saying I needed to man up or get out of his house. About deciding to show him exactly what his version of manhood looked like. Theo's pen moved across his notepad the whole time, his face staying neutral. So you stopped showering because he said hygiene was feminine? Theo asked. I nodded. He told me to be a real man. Real men apparently don't care about being clean. Theo wrote that down. And the violence? The incident with the mailman? I explained how real men settled everything with fighting, how I was just following Dad's logic to its conclusion. Theo's eyebrows went up when I described wrestling a federal employee on our front lawn. Your father's response to these incidents was what? Theo asked. I thought back. He kept trying to get me to stop, but he wouldn't admit he was wrong. Every time I asked if he wanted me to be soft, he couldn't say yes, because that would mean backing down. Theo nodded slowly. And the roadkill? I told him about needing to be a hunter, about bringing home trophies, about Dad's girlfriend throwing up and leaving, about his co-workers complaining about the smell, about getting suspended from the school. Theo filled 3 pages with notes. Has your father ever been physically violent with you? He asked. I shook my head. No. Just the toxic masculinity stuff, the emotional manipulation. Theo wrote that down too. Do you have other family you could stay with? Your mother? I nodded. She lives across town. They're divorced. Through the wall, I could hear Dad's voice rising and falling in the living room, and I caught fragments of what he was saying. Psychiatric evaluation, and danger to himself, and completely out of nowhere. My stomach dropped further, because I realized he was building a case that I was mentally ill, that this had nothing to do with him. Theo noticed my expression. What is it? He asked. I gestured at the wall. He's telling your partner that I'm crazy, that this was spontaneous psychosis or whatever. He's making it sound like he had nothing to do with it. Theo's face stayed professional, but something shifted in his eyes. We'll get the full picture, he said. That's why we do separate interviews. But I could hear Dad through the wall painting himself as this desperate father dealing with a disturbed son, and the fear hit me that maybe CPS would believe him. Maybe they'd think I really was having a breakdown. Maybe they'd put me in a hospital somewhere while Dad got to walk away like the victim. He told me to man up or get out, I said again, needing Theo to understand. This whole thing started because he couldn't handle me being in theater. He said I was being soft and needed to be a real man. Theo nodded. I've got that in my notes. Multiple times. He closed his notebook. I'm going to make some calls. Stay here for a few minutes. He left, and I sat on my bed in my loincloth, listening to Dad's voice continue his performance in the other room. The deer head stared at me from the wall with its glass eyes, and I felt like the biggest idiot in the world. I'd been so focused on proving a point that I hadn't thought about what would happen when someone official got involved. Now Dad was spinning the whole thing to make himself look good, and me look insane. Theo came back about 10 minutes later and closed the door again. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. I'm going to call your mother on speaker. We need to verify some information. He dialed, and Mom answered on the second ring. Hello? Her voice sounded worried even through the phone. Miss Johnson? This is Theo Montgomery from Child Protective Services. I'm here with your son, and we need to ask you some questions. There was a pause. Is he okay? What happened? Mom asked, and I heard the fear in her voice. He's physically safe, Theo said. We're conducting an assessment of the home situation. Can you verify that you and the father are divorced and living separately? Mom confirmed it. Yes. We divorced 3 years ago. I live across town. Why? What's going on? Theo explained that there were concerns about the living conditions and my welfare. Are you willing and able to have your son stay with you while we complete our assessment? He asked. Yes, Mom said immediately. Absolutely. Can I talk to him? Is he there? Theo handed me the phone. Mom? I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted. Honey, what happened? Are you okay? She asked. The worry in her voice made me feel guilty for not calling her sooner. I'm okay, I said. It's complicated. I'll explain when I see you. We talked for another minute while Theo took notes. Then he took the phone back and confirmed some logistics with Mom. Her address, her work schedule, whether she had space for me. She answered everything quickly, and I could tell she was trying not to freak out. When Theo hung up, he looked at me seriously. We're going to implement an emergency safety plan. You'll stay with your mother while we complete our assessment of both homes and coordinate with your school. Your father won't be able to contact you except through supervised channels that we'll set up. I nodded, trying to process what that meant. He can't call me? I asked. Not directly, Theo said. Any contact has to go through us or happen in supervised visits. This is for your safety, while we figure out what's going on. The relief hit me first, then the weird guilt. Dad was still my father, even if he was a terrible one. Okay, I said quietly. Theo's partner appeared in the doorway holding a black trash bag. For packing essentials, she said, handing it to me. Theo stood up. Pack clothes, school supplies, anything you need for the next few days. I'll supervise while you do that. I started pulling clothes from my dresser, trying to find things that were clean enough to wear. Most of my stuff smelled terrible from the week of not showering. I grabbed my school backpack and dumped out the old papers, then started shoving in notebooks and textbooks. My laptop went in next, then the charger. My hands shook while I packed, and I felt aware of every movement, like one wrong choice could make everything worse. Dad appeared in the hallway, hovering near my door. Where is he going? He demanded. With his mother while we complete our assessment, Theo said firmly. You'll be contacted about next steps. Dad's face went red. This is ridiculous. I'm his father. You can't just take him. Theo stepped between Dad and me. We can, and we are. Please give us space to finish packing. Dad muttered something about lawyers and how I'd destroyed everything. How his job was gone, his girlfriend was gone, all because of me. Theo's voice got harder. Sir, I need you to step back. I grabbed my phone charger and my deodorant from the bathroom, and the irony of packing deodorant now wasn't lost on me. My laptop bag went over my shoulder, and I clutched the trash bag of clothes. I'm ready, I said. Theo nodded and gestured for me to follow him. We walked past Dad in the hallway, and he just stared at me with this mixture of rage and something that might have been hurt. You're destroying this family, he said. I didn't answer. What was there to say? The drive to Mom's apartment took 20 minutes and nobody talked much. Theo drove while his partner sat in front making notes on her tablet. I sat in the back, clutching my trash bag and watching the streetlights go by. It was after midnight when we pulled up to Mom's building. She was waiting outside and rushed over as soon as we parked. Oh, honey, she said, and hugged me carefully. She didn't comment on the smell or the loincloth, just held me for a second. Theo got out and talked with Mom quietly, explaining the safety plan and giving her paperwork. His partner handed over more forms. I stood there feeling numb and surreal, like this was happening to someone else. I'll call tomorrow to schedule the home assessment here and coordinate with the school, Theo told Mom. She nodded, signing papers and asking questions about what happened next. Finally, Theo and his partner left, and Mom led me inside. Her apartment was small but clean, and she showed me where the bathroom was. There are clean towels on the counter, she said. Take your time. I stood under the hot shower for 40 minutes, scrubbing away a week of deliberate filth. The water ran brown at first, then gray, then finally clear. I used her shampoo twice and her soap 3 times, watching the grime circle the drain. My skin turned pink from scrubbing, but I kept going, needing to feel clean again. When I finally got out, I found borrowed clothes waiting on the counter. Old sweatpants and a t-shirt that were probably Mom's but fit okay. I put them on and stared at myself in the foggy mirror. Without the dirt and the loincloth, I looked like myself again. The choice to be clean felt like taking back a tiny piece of control. Like maybe I could stop being Dad's version of a man and figure out who I actually was. The next morning, I woke up on an air mattress in Mom's living room, confused for a second about where I was. Then everything came rushing back. Mom was already up making coffee and her phone rang while I was brushing my teeth with a new toothbrush she'd bought. It's Theo, she called. I came out and she put it on speaker. Theo explained he needed to do a home assessment here to verify it was a safe environment. He'd come by this afternoon. He also needed to coordinate with my school about my return, since I was still technically suspended. They've been notified about the CPS case, he said. The principal wants a meeting before you come back. Mom wrote down the details and confirmed times. When she hung up, she looked at me carefully. Are you hungry? I can make pancakes. I nodded and sat at her small kitchen table while she mixed batter. Everything felt surreal and wrong, but also somehow safer. The apartment was quiet. Nobody was yelling or demanding I prove my manhood. I was wearing clean clothes and my hair smelled like shampoo. Mom set a plate of pancakes in front of me, and I ate slowly, tasting actual food instead of just fuel. Do you want to talk about what happened? She asked gently. I shook my head. Not yet. She nodded. Okay, when you're ready. We ate in silence, and I tried not to think about Dad alone in his house, probably planning his next move. Around noon, my phone started buzzing with texts from Dad. I picked it up and immediately regretted it. You've ruined my career, was the first one. I hope you're happy destroying everything I worked for, came next. Then, the rent is due next week, and I got suspended without pay because of your stunt. Mixed in were jabs about me being too weak to handle real manhood, about running to Mommy like a baby. Mom saw my face and held out her hand. Can I see? I gave her the phone and watched her read through the messages, her expression getting harder with each one. You don't have to respond to these, she said. Theo said all communication should go through him, right? I nodded. Then let's document this and send it to him. She started taking screenshots of every message, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I felt relieved that I didn't have to figure out what to say back. The messages kept coming while she worked. More guilt trips about money, more accusations about ruining his life. Mom finished screenshotting and typed a message to Theo with all the images attached. There, she said. He can handle it. She set my phone down and looked at me seriously. None of this is your fault. You know that, right? I wasn't sure I believed her, but I nodded anyway. That afternoon, Mom's phone rang again. It's the school, she said, checking the caller ID. She answered, and I listened to her side of the conversation. A lot of, I understand, and, yes, that makes sense. When she hung up, she explained that Principal Peacock wanted a meeting before I could return. The counselor would be there too. They were treating this as a serious re-entry situation, not just a regular suspension ending. When? I asked. Tomorrow afternoon, Mom said. They want to make sure you have support in place before you come back to classes. I felt my stomach twist. Going back to the school after everything that happened sounded terrible. Everyone had probably heard about the loincloth incident at Dad's office, about me challenging the math teacher to combat, about the whole primitive living thing. I was going to be the weird kid who went crazy for a few weeks. Mom seemed to read my mind. It's going to be okay, she said. We'll figure it out one step at a time. I wanted to believe her, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of performing masculinity. Tired of fighting. Tired of trying to prove points. I just wanted to be normal again, whatever that meant. My phone buzzed with another text from Dad, and Mom took it from me without asking. I'll keep this for now, she said gently. You don't need to see any more of that today. I nodded and let her take it, feeling some of the weight lift. At least for today, I didn't have to figure out how to respond. I didn't have to defend myself or explain. I could just sit in Mom's quiet apartment and be clean and safe, and that was enough. The next morning, I woke up to find Mom going through my backpack at the kitchen table. She pulled out each piece of clothing without saying anything, just setting aside the shirts that reeked of roadkill and the jeans stiff with dirt and sweat. I watched from the couch where I'd slept, feeling embarrassed but too tired to explain. She bagged everything up and tied the trash bag closed, then grabbed her keys. 2 hours later, she came back with Target bags full of basic stuff. Plain t-shirts, new jeans, socks that actually matched. She set them on the table next to me and went to wash my backpack in the sink, scrubbing it twice with dish soap to get the smell out. When she finished, she bought new notebooks and pencils, the cheap kind that worked fine, and put them in the clean backpack without making me feel bad about ruining the old ones. She just gave me the tools I needed to start over and went back to making lunch like it was normal. That night, I fell asleep on the air mattress, but woke up gasping around 2 in the morning. The dream had been so real. CPS workers putting me in a van while Dad stood on the porch, telling neighbors I was mentally ill and dangerous. The group home had bars on the windows and kids who looked at me like I was the crazy one. I sat up breathing hard, trying to remember where I actually was. Mom appeared in the doorway still dressed, and I realized she'd been sleeping on the couch to stay close. She didn't ask about the nightmare or try to hug me. She just sat down on the floor next to my air mattress and started talking about some cooking show she'd been watching. Something about people making cakes that looked like objects. Her voice was calm and normal, describing this contestant who made a cake shaped like a toolbox that actually fooled the judges. I focused on her words instead of the dream images, and slowly my breathing went back to normal. She never said anything about Dad or CPS or how she'd warned me this would happen. She just sat there until I fell back asleep. Theo showed up at 9 the next morning for the home assessment. Mom had already cleaned the apartment and made sure everything looked organized. He walked through each room with a clipboard, checking that I had my own sleeping space even though it was just an air mattress in the corner of the living room. He opened the fridge and pantry, noting that we had actual food and not just takeout containers. He asked Mom about her work schedule, and she explained her remote job doing data entry, showing him her computer setup and how her hours were flexible enough to be around when I got home from the school. She had my school enrollment paperwork ready, showing she'd already registered me in the local district and set up transportation. Theo wrote everything down and seemed satisfied that this was a stable place for me to stay. He asked me a few questions about how I was feeling and if I felt safe here. I told him yes, and he made a note before heading out to do Dad's assessment. Later that afternoon, Theo called Mom's phone and put it on speaker, so we could both hear. He'd just left Dad's house, and his voice sounded tired. The deer head was still mounted on my bedroom wall with construction adhesive that had damaged the paint. The garage was full of roadkill in various states of decay that Dad apparently hadn't bothered cleaning up. The loincloth was hanging on the porch railing to dry like it was laundry. Theo had taken photos of everything. He said Dad tried to explain it as boys being boys, just normal teenage experimentation with hunting and primitive skills. But the photos showed a home where dangerous behavior had been allowed to get completely out of control without any adult intervention. Theo said the report would reflect that. The school meeting happened at 3 that afternoon. Principal Peacock sat at the head of the conference table with Haley Carson, the counselor, on one side. Mom and I sat across from them. Peacock had my file open in front of her with notes about the math teacher incident and my failing grades. Haley spoke first, suggesting a behavioral contract that would spell out exactly what was expected of me and what would happen if I messed up. She wanted weekly check-ins to talk about how things were going and to catch problems before they got big. The focus would be on rebuilding trust and getting my grades back up, not just punishing me for what already happened. Principal Peacock nodded along and then added her piece. My suspension would stand for the full 2 weeks, but she outlined a pathway for making up the work I'd missed. After-school sessions with teachers who volunteered their time, modified assignments that would let me demonstrate I'd learned the material without having to do every single worksheet. She was firm about the combat challenge being a serious line I'd crossed. Teachers needed to feel safe at the school, but she also acknowledged that there had been issues at home that contributed to my behavior. They weren't excusing it, just recognizing that I needed support to get back on track, not just punishment. That evening, Theo called again while Mom was making dinner. He explained the next steps. Dad could see me, but only at supervised visits in neutral locations. Not at his house where all the roadkill was. Not anywhere private where things could escalate. Every visit had to be scheduled through CPS ahead of time. A caseworker would be in the room the whole time taking notes. It felt both relieving and strange. He was still my father, but now there were all these official rules about when and how we could be around each other. Later that same day, Dad's work situation got worse. Hassan Jung from HR sent him an email that Mom showed me after Dad forwarded it to her phone. His suspension was extended pending a psychological evaluation. The company needed to make sure he was fit to return to his position after the office incident with the loincloth and spear. Dad immediately texted my phone with angry messages. This was my fault. My stunt with CPS had ruined his career. I felt the guilt starting to build in my chest, like it always did when Dad was mad. But Mom sat down next to me and walked through it logically. Dad's work problems came from his own choices. He was the adult who let things escalate. He was the one who showed up to my school in that state. He was the one who tried to blame everything on me when CPS arrived. His consequences were his own, not mine. I wanted to believe her, but it was hard. That night, I opened my phone and started going through my social media accounts. They were full of toxic garbage I'd been consuming for weeks. Memes about alpha males and dominance. Posts about how real men never apologized or showed weakness. Screenshots of arguments where I'd defended primitive masculinity like it was some noble truth. Looking back at it made me feel sick and embarrassed. I'd convinced myself this was real masculinity, when it was just angry nonsense from people who were probably as messed up as I'd been. I deleted my accounts one by one. It felt like a small step, but removing that content from my daily feed made space for something else. Space to remember who I'd been before Dad's ultimatum about manning up. The next day at my check-in with Haley, she suggested I try journaling, write about what triggered my anger and when I heard Dad's voice in my head versus my own thoughts. I rolled my eyes because it sounded exactly like therapy homework, but that night I couldn't sleep, and I pulled out one of the new notebooks Mom had bought. I started writing about the report card incident, how Dad had looked at my grades and seen only the theater and choir classes, how he'd crumpled the paper and thrown it at me, how his face had been red with rage over something that should have made him proud. I wrote 3 pages before my hand cramped, and when I finally stopped, I actually felt a little bit better, like I'd gotten something out of my head and onto paper where it couldn't chase me in circles anymore. 3 days later, Theo drove me to a CPS office building downtown, for the first supervised visit with Dad. The conference room had gray walls and a long table with uncomfortable plastic chairs, and Theo sat in the corner with a notepad, while Dad and I faced each other across the scratched surface. Dad asked how school was going and whether I was keeping up with homework, his voice careful and measured like he was reading from a script. I told him about the makeup assignments and the behavioral contract, and he nodded along with this fake interested expression. Then his eyes scanned me from head to toe, and his mouth twisted slightly. He said I looked soft again now that I was showering regularly, and the words came out before he could stop himself. I watched Theo's pen move across his notepad in the corner, scratching away at the paper while Dad's face went pale as he realized what he'd just said. Theo set his pen down and leaned forward in his chair. He reminded Dad in this calm but firm voice that this visit was about rebuilding a healthy relationship, and insults about masculinity were exactly what created this entire situation in the first place. Dad's jaw got tight and his hands clenched on the table, but he forced out an apology that sounded stiff and rehearsed. I felt this weird sense of validation wash over me because someone with actual authority was correcting him to his face, not letting him get away with the toxic garbage he usually said. The rest of the visit stayed awkward and surface level, with Dad asking safe questions about what Mom was cooking for dinner and whether her apartment had enough space. When the hour ended, Theo walked Dad out first, and then came back to check if I was okay. I told him I was fine, and he made a note in his file before driving me back to Mom's place. That evening, Mom made spaghetti, and we ate together at her small kitchen table. After we cleaned up the dishes, she sat down next to me on the couch and started talking about Dad's childhood. She explained that Dad's father, my other grandpa who died when I was really little, was extremely strict about emotions and masculinity. Grandpa apparently punished Dad for crying or showing any kind of fear, telling him that real men never showed weakness. Mom wasn't trying to excuse Dad's behavior, just giving me context that his toxic beliefs came from somewhere specific. I felt this confusing mix of anger and sad understanding sitting in my chest, because part of me wanted to stay mad at Dad for everything he put me through, but another part could see how he'd been damaged by his own father, the same way he tried to damage me. Mom said the cycle had to stop somewhere, and maybe that somewhere was with me refusing to pass it on. My first day back at the school the following Monday was awkward as hell. Everyone had heard about the loincloth incident because apparently Dad's co-workers had kids at my school, and the story spread like wildfire through the hallways. Some guys made jokes about me going primitive and asked if I'd brought my spear to class. I kept my head down and tried to ignore the comments, but my face burned hot every time someone laughed. After third period, Haley pulled me aside in the hallway near her office. She asked how I was holding up with all the attention, and I admitted it was embarrassing, but I was trying to get through it. Haley nodded and said, most gossip died down after a week or two when people found something new to talk about. Talking through the embarrassment with someone who didn't judge me helped me get through the rest of the day without losing it. The next afternoon, Haley called me to her office during study hall. She suggested I might want to ease back into something I enjoyed before all this started, and she mentioned Kieran, who taught theater. Haley said Kieran remembered me from freshman year when I'd been in the fall play, and he was willing to offer me a low-pressure crew position on the upcoming spring show. No audition required, just showing up and helping with sets and technical stuff. I felt surprised that anyone remembered me from before the whole toxic masculinity disaster, and the idea of doing something I used to love felt both exciting and scary. Haley gave me Kieran's room number and told me to stop by when I was ready. 2 days later, Theo showed up at Mom's apartment for a safety check to confirm I was settling in properly. He walked through the small space, checking that I had my own sleeping area set up in the corner of the living room, and he looked in the fridge to verify there was actual food. Theo sat down with me and reviewed my behavioral contract progress, asking about my counseling sessions with Haley and whether I was keeping up with the makeup work from my suspension. I showed him my assignment tracker and the completed homework in my backpack, and he made notes documenting positive adjustment for the case file. Before he left, Theo mentioned that Dad's second supervised visit was scheduled for the following week, but 3 days before that visit was supposed to happen, Theo called to say it was canceled. Dad had never scheduled the required psychological evaluation that both his work and CPS had mandated, so the visit couldn't proceed. I felt angry that Dad wasn't even trying to meet the basic requirements, but I also felt relieved that I didn't have to sit through another tense hour of him performing normalcy. Mom said it was typical Dad behavior, avoiding anything that might make him look bad or admit he had problems. That same week, I finally worked up the nerve to visit Kieran's classroom after school. The theater info meeting was happening, and about 15 students sat in the auditorium seats, while Kieran stood on stage explaining the spring show and the different crew roles available. He talked about build crew for sets, run crew for backstage during performances, lights and sound tech and costume design. When he finished his presentation, Kieran came down and walked over to where I was sitting. He said he remembered my work from freshman year and casually offered me a spot on the build crew where I could work with my hands and be useful without being in the spotlight. It felt like a safe way to dip my toes back into something that used to make me happy, and I agreed to come to the first work session on Saturday. Alone in my room at Mom's that night, I pulled out an old script from freshman year that I'd saved in a box. I started practicing a monologue out loud just to see if I still could, but Dad's voice immediately filled my head, calling it fairy bullcrap and saying I sounded weak. I stopped halfway through, frustrated that he was still controlling my thoughts even when he wasn't physically in the room with me. The script sat open on my lap while I stared at the words, wanting to keep going, but feeling paralyzed by the toxic messages still living in my brain. At my next counseling session with Haley 2 days later, I told her about trying to read the monologue and how Dad's voice had shut me down. Haley listened and then started reframing the language Dad had used against me. She said, soft wasn't a weakness. It was skilled at understanding people and situations. Sensitive wasn't bad. It was being aware of emotions and able to respond to them. She gave me different words for the qualities Dad had taught me to hate about myself, turning them into strengths instead of failures. Then Haley set a micro goal for me, just attending one full theater rehearsal without judging myself for being there. She said the goal wasn't to perform perfectly or prove anything, just to show up and participate. Focusing on showing up rather than being perfect felt more manageable than trying to be great at something right away. 3 days later, Mom's phone buzzed during dinner with a text from Dad that just said, "Did it. Happy?" She showed me the screen, and I felt annoyed at his attitude, like he was doing us some huge favor by checking a box that CPS and his job both required. But underneath the irritation was this small feeling of relief, because it meant the supervised visits could keep happening, and maybe eventually we'd get to something that felt less like a court proceeding. Mom texted back a neutral, "Good," and we went back to eating, not making a big deal about it even though it was the first requirement he'd actually completed. The second supervised visit got scheduled for Thursday afternoon at the same CPS office, and I sat in the waiting room with sweaty palms while Theo set up the conference room. Dad arrived exactly on time, which felt like another checkbox he was ticking off, and we went in and sat across from each other at the same table. Theo sat in the corner with his notepad and reminded us both that this hour was for rebuilding communication and connection. For the first 20 minutes, we just stared at the table while Theo occasionally suggested conversation topics like how school was going or what I'd been doing at Mom's place. I answered in short sentences, and Dad nodded, and the silence between exchanges stretched out so long I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Neither of us knew how to talk without the toxic masculinity script running underneath everything, without Dad judging whether I sounded weak or me waiting for him to criticize my choices. By minute 40, I felt exhausted from the forced civility, from trying to find safe topics that wouldn't trigger either of us into old patterns. We made it through the full hour, but when Theo asked how we both felt about the visit, I just shrugged and said it was fine, which was technically true, but also completely inadequate for describing how draining it was. Dad stood up to leave, and Theo asked him to wait a moment, then explained that as part of the safety plan, Dad was required to attend a parenting class series about healthy communication and age-appropriate expectations. Dad's face went bright red and his jaw clenched, and I could see him fighting the urge to argue or refuse. Theo handed him a paper with the class schedule and location, 8 weekly sessions starting next Tuesday evening, and Dad took it with shaking hands. He agreed through gritted teeth that he'd attend, and I felt this small sense of vindication that he actually had to do work to fix this, that it wasn't just me jumping through hoops while he got to stay the same. After Dad left, Theo asked if I wanted to debrief the visit, and I told him it was weird, but okay, that nothing bad happened, but nothing good happened either. The next day at the school, Haley pulled me aside during lunch to work on something practical. She said classmates would keep asking questions about what happened with the loincloth incident and the CPS involvement, and having a prepared response would help me feel less defensive. We practiced a neutral statement together, something like, "Family stuff got complicated, but we're working it out," that shut down gossip without oversharing details that weren't anyone's business. Haley made me say it out loud 5 times until it felt natural coming out of my mouth, and she reminded me I didn't owe anyone an explanation beyond that. Having the words ready made me feel more prepared to face the questions I knew were coming, like I had a shield against the curiosity and judgment. Saturday afternoon, I showed up to my first theater crew session, walking into the auditorium where about 12 students were already gathered around the stage. Tanner, the crew lead, was a senior with paint-stained jeans and an easy smile, and he welcomed me back without making it awkward. He put me on painting detail with 3 other students working on backdrop panels, where I could work quietly and get reacquainted with the space without having to perform or be in the spotlight. Being backstage with the paint smell and the sound of people running lines on stage felt like coming home after a long trip somewhere terrible, like finding a piece of myself I'd deliberately buried. I focused on steady brushstrokes, filling in a sky gradient on a flat panel, and nobody asked me about Dad or CPS or why I'd been gone. Monday morning, Hassan from Dad's HR department sent an email that Mom forwarded to me. Dad's job was giving him a conditional return date 2 weeks out, contingent on completing the parenting class and maintaining appropriate boundaries at work. The email outlined modified responsibilities and mandatory weekly check-ins with Hassan for the first month back. I felt less guilty about his financial situation, knowing he had a path back to employment, even if it came with conditions and oversight he probably hated. That same week, Mom sat down with me to explain she was formally requesting a co-parenting agreement through Ramona Lancaster, the family court liaison Theo had connected us with. The agreement would outline specific rules about communication, decision-making, and boundaries that both parents had to follow. Mom showed me the draft document with sections about school decisions, medical care, and how Dad could contact me, and having everything in writing made me feel more secure. It meant Dad couldn't just change the rules when he got angry, couldn't text me directly with guilt trips or demands, couldn't show up at the school without permission. The structure felt protective rather than restrictive, like building a fence that kept everyone on their own side. In English class on Wednesday, Mrs. Patterson asked for volunteers to read a passage from the novel we were studying. My hand went up before I could overthink it, and she called on me with a surprised smile. My voice shook reading the first sentence, but I pushed through the whole paragraph, focusing on the words instead of how I sounded. A few classmates nodded encouragingly when I finished, and Mrs. Patterson thanked me, and I realized not everyone was judging me for the loincloth incident. Pushing through the fear of sounding soft felt like a tiny victory, like reclaiming space I'd given up when Dad's voice took over my head. That night, Mom's phone buzzed with a text from Dad, and she showed me a photo of his old high school football gear spread out on his bed. The message said, "This meant something to me once," which felt like his awkward attempt to share something vulnerable or connect on some level I didn't fully understand. I stared at the faded jersey and scuffed helmet, trying to imagine Dad as a teenager before he became so rigid about masculinity. Mom said I didn't have to respond if I didn't want to, but I felt cautiously curious about what he was like before all the toxic beliefs took over. I texted back, "What position did you play?" And he answered, "Linebacker." Loved the strategy more than the hitting, which surprised me because it was the most honest thing he'd said in months. The third supervised visit happened the following week, and Dad seemed slightly less tense walking into the conference room. We talked about neutral stuff like his project deadlines at work and my upcoming show dates, and for 30 minutes it felt almost normal. Then Dad made a comment about theater being, "Fine, I guess, if that's what you need," with this tone that suggested it was some kind of crutch or weakness. Theo immediately stopped writing and looked up, warning Dad that conditional support wasn't real support, and comments like that undermined the whole purpose of these visits. Dad's face flashed frustration, but he backed down and apologized, and I could tell he hated that the rules had teeth, and he couldn't just say whatever he wanted. Theo reminded both of us that rebuilding trust meant Dad had to genuinely accept my choices, not just tolerate them with passive-aggressive jabs. After the visit, I felt drained, but also validated that someone was holding Dad accountable in real time, not letting him slide back into old patterns just because he showed up. My next session with Haley happened 2 days later, and she pulled out a notebook to work on what she called boundary scripts. We spent 40 minutes writing down exact phrases I could use when Dad crossed lines. Stuff like, "I need you to stop commenting on my appearance," and "That topic isn't helpful right now." She made me practice saying them out loud over and over until they didn't feel so weird in my mouth. The repetition helped because I could hear my own voice getting steadier with each run-through. By the end of the session, I had 5 phrases memorized, and Haley said having prepared words would keep me from just freezing up or getting angry when Dad pushed buttons. Walking out of her office, I felt like I actually had tools instead of just hoping things would go okay. Auditions for the spring show happened that Thursday after school, and I showed up to the theater with my stomach doing flips. Kieran had about 15 kids trying out, and I went near the end with a monologue from a play we'd read in English class. My voice shook through the first few lines, and I forgot to breathe properly, so the projection was weak. When I finished, Kieran nodded and scribbled notes without any judgment on his face. He called me over after everyone auditioned and said I needed to work on breath support and projecting from my diaphragm instead of my throat. Then he told me I was cast in the ensemble, not a lead, but a real part of the show. The satisfaction hit different from anything involving Dad's approval ever had, because I'd earned this spot through actual effort. Dad attended his first parenting class with Jade that weekend, and afterward my phone buzzed with a text that just said, "Show me your audition stuff." I stared at the message for a solid minute, trying to figure out if he was genuinely asking or setting up another chance to criticize. Mom looked over my shoulder and said, I didn't have to respond if I wasn't ready. I texted back, "Why do you want to see it?" Because I needed to know his actual intention before opening that door. He replied, "Jade said I should show interest in your activities," which was honest at least, even if it came from his class homework instead of real curiosity. I sent him the audition time and show dates, but added, "No negative comments," as a clear boundary. Theo called Mom the next day to schedule a family team meeting for the following week, with school people participating. He explained this was where everyone got together to coordinate and make sure the safety plan was actually working for everyone involved. The idea of having Dad, Mom, Haley, and Theo all in one conference room made my chest tight with anxiety. But part of me felt hopeful that official structure with witnesses might keep things productive, instead of letting Dad derail everything with his usual tactics. Theo said the meeting would review progress and discuss the pathway toward less supervision if Dad kept following the rules. Kieran posted the callback results on the theater bulletin board Monday morning, and my name appeared under ensemble members for the spring production. Seeing it in writing made it feel official and real. I pulled out my phone and texted Mom the news before I even thought about whether to tell Dad. She responded with 3 exclamation points and said she'd marked all the show dates on her calendar. The fact that my first instinct was to share good news with Mom instead of worrying about Dad's reaction felt like progress I could actually measure. The 4th supervised visit happened Wednesday afternoon, and I walked into the conference room with my boundary phrases ready in my head. Dad sat down across from me, and Theo settled into his corner with the ever-present notepad. We talked about neutral stuff for about 10 minutes before Dad glanced at my shirt and started to say something with that familiar critical tone. I cut him off clearly and said, "I need you to stop commenting on my appearance." His face flashed anger for a second, and I watched him catch himself and redirect. He asked about my classes instead, and we spent the rest of the visit discussing my makeup work and show rehearsal schedule. Walking out afterward, I felt genuinely competent at handling conflict with actual tools instead of just shutting down or exploding. Principal Peacock emailed Mom Thursday morning with an update on my academic progress. All my makeup work was completed and turned in. My behavioral contract was on track with no incidents. I was pulling B's in most classes, which felt solid considering where I'd started. The email said the school was removing the daily check-ins and moving to weekly meetings since I'd demonstrated consistent compliance. Reading over Mom's shoulder, I felt proud of progress I could actually point to instead of just hoping things were getting better. Dad's boss, Luis, sent him an email Friday that he forwarded to Mom about his work situation. He was reinstated on a performance improvement plan with reduced responsibilities and mandatory HR check-ins. Dad's text to Mom about it dripped with frustration about the demotion and the monitoring. I felt weird and mixed up about the whole thing because part of me was relieved he had income again, but another part was glad he didn't have full authority like before. Mom said it was okay to have complicated feelings about Dad's consequences. That weekend, Mom and I sat down at her kitchen table with a blank notebook to write house rules for her apartment. We spent 2 hours talking through basics, like respectful communication and shared chores, and my responsibility for keeping up with school and counseling. Having clear expectations that we both agreed to made me feel ownership over my environment. These weren't rules being imposed on me. These were agreements we made together about how to live in the same space. Mom wrote everything down in the notebook, and we both signed it at the bottom like a contract. Rehearsal started Monday after school, and I showed up early to help Kieran set up chairs. The ensemble work involved learning choreography and harmonies alongside other students who treated me normally. Nobody brought up the loincloth incident or asked weird questions about CPS. Tanner showed me where the crew kept supplies and explained the rehearsal schedule. Finding my rhythm backstage with tasks and teamwork felt like belonging without needing to prove anything. I didn't have to perform some version of masculinity or dominate anyone. I just had to show up and do the work. A few days later, Mom handed me an envelope with Dad's return address, and I opened it at the kitchen table while she watched quietly. The letter was typed and formatted weird with bullet points and specific language about creating an unsafe environment and imposing rigid expectations on my development. I could tell he'd drafted it in Jade's parenting class because nobody talks like this normally, but he actually named things he did wrong, like demanding I quit theater and telling me to man up or get out. The apology felt stiff and awkward, but he wasn't making excuses or blaming me, and I read it twice, feeling something shift in my chest that wasn't quite forgiveness, but maybe less anger. I showed Mom, and she nodded slowly, saying it was a start even if it wasn't perfect, and I agreed it was better than nothing. That night I sat down with a notebook and wrote back to Dad listing my conditions in clear bullet points like his letter. No more comments about my appearance or how I dress or style my hair. No more remarks about my interests being soft or feminine or wrong. No sabotaging my school choices or trying to push me toward activities I don't want. No making fun of theater or choir or anything I choose to do. I wrote that I was willing to keep doing supervised visits if he could follow these rules, but if he couldn't respect my boundaries, then I didn't want contact at all. Writing it out made me feel powerful and clear, like I was defining what our relationship could be, instead of just accepting whatever he decided. Mom read it over and suggested I add one more point about him not bad-mouthing Mom to me, so I included that too. I mailed the letter the next morning and felt good about standing up for myself with actual words instead of performative aggression. The family team meeting happened the following Thursday in a conference room at the CPS office with everyone sitting around a long table. Theo sat at the head with his supervisor Dave Montgomery next to him, holding a thick folder. Haley came from the school and sat beside Mom, while Dad took a seat across from us, looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt. Dave opened the meeting by reviewing the written safety plan they'd drafted, going through each point about supervised visits and appropriate communication, and Dad completing the parenting class. Everyone had a copy of the document, and I followed along as Dave explained that the plan allowed for continued supervised visits with a pathway to phone contact once Dad demonstrated consistent boundary respect. Theo added that they'd been monitoring Dad's compliance with the parenting class and his behavior during visits, and so far he was meeting minimum requirements. Dad signed the agreement without arguing or making sarcastic comments, just picked up the pen and wrote his name at the bottom. Mom signed next, then I signed as a participant in the plan. The whole thing felt tense but real, like actual progress was happening even though nobody was pretending everything was fixed. Haley asked if I had any concerns, and I said I wanted to make sure Dad actually followed the rules about not commenting on my appearance, and Theo confirmed that any violations would be documented and could affect the monitoring plan. Dad's face tightened, but he nodded and said he understood. We wrapped up after 40 minutes with everyone agreeing to reconvene in 6 weeks to assess progress. After the meeting, Theo pulled me and Mom aside to explain the next steps. He said CPS would close the active investigation and move to monitoring status once Dad completed the full parenting class series and maintained 6 weeks of appropriate contact without boundary violations. Having a clear finish line with specific criteria made the whole process feel less endless. Theo showed us a timeline on paper with checkboxes for each requirement and target dates, and I felt relief seeing it mapped out instead of just floating in uncertainty. He explained that monitoring status meant I'd stay with Mom by choice, and Dad's visits could gradually increase from supervised to phone calls to possibly unsupervised time if everything went well. Mom asked what would happen if Dad violated the boundaries, and Theo said they'd reassess and potentially extend monitoring or add more requirements. I asked if I could refuse visits if I wasn't comfortable, and Theo confirmed that my input mattered in decisions about contact. Walking out to the parking lot afterward, I felt like the system was actually working to keep me safe, instead of just punishing me for Dad's mistakes. The next week, Mom got a call from Theo, mentioning that Dad had attended his second parenting class session. Apparently during a group exercise about family patterns, Dad shared one memory about his own father having strict rules about crying and showing weakness. Jade, the instructor, mentioned it to Theo during a check-in call because it showed Dad was starting to engage with the material instead of just sitting there. Mom told me about it over dinner, and I felt weird mixed feelings knowing Dad struggled with his own history. It didn't excuse what he did to me, but it helped me understand where his toxic beliefs came from. I asked Mom if she knew much about my other grandpa, and she said he was a hard man who believed in tough discipline and never showed affection. She said Dad probably learned that men don't apologize or admit mistakes from watching his father, and now he was trying to unlearn those patterns, even if it was awkward and forced. I sat with that information for a while, feeling measured empathy for Dad's situation without letting go of my anger about how he treated me. 2 weeks later, Theo called to say he was officially closing the active CPS case and moving us to monitoring status. Dad had completed 3 parenting class sessions and maintained appropriate boundaries during supervised visits. I could stay with Mom by choice, and Dad's visits could gradually increase from weekly supervised meetings to bi-weekly phone calls if he kept following the rules. The relief hit me hard, knowing the investigation part was over and I wasn't in immediate danger of being removed or forced back to Dad's house. But I also felt the weight of boundaries still being necessary, understanding we weren't magically fixed, just functionally safer. Theo said the monitoring period would last 6 months with regular check-ins, and if everything stayed stable, they'd close the case completely. Mom hugged me after the call, and I let myself feel the safety of her apartment and the choice to be here instead of being trapped at Dad's place performing some twisted version of masculinity. At the school, Principal Peacock called me into her office that Friday to review my progress. She pulled up my file on her computer showing 8 weeks of consistent compliance with the behavioral contract and no incidents since I'd returned. My grades were solid Bs across the board, and teachers reported I was participating appropriately in class. She printed out a form removing the behavioral flag from my record, explaining that I demonstrated the ability to meet expectations without daily monitoring. The quiet accomplishment I felt was more satisfying than any explosive manning up ever was. Haley joined us for the last part of the meeting and confirmed our counseling sessions could move to every other week instead of weekly. She said I was developing good coping skills and using the boundary scripts effectively, and she was proud of my progress. Walking back to class, I felt genuinely good about meeting expectations through steady effort instead of dramatic gestures. Rehearsals became routine over the next 2 weeks with small moments of competency building up. I nailed a 3-part harmony during a run-through, and Kieran gave me a thumbs up from the director's table. I finished painting a set piece early and helped a younger student figure out the technique for blending colors. Tanner showed me how to operate the light board, and I picked it up quickly enough that he put me on the crew rotation. The grounded pride I felt came from being useful and skilled, not from dominating anyone or proving I was tough. Other cast members started including me in conversations about weekend plans, and nobody brought up the loincloth incident anymore. I was just another person in the ensemble doing the work and being part of the team. Dad and I had another supervised visit that Wednesday, where he actually respected my boundaries. Theo sat in his usual corner spot, while Dad and I talked across the table. Dad asked about school, and I told him about my grades improving. He asked about the show, and I explained my crew responsibilities. Then he talked about his performance plan at work, without blaming me for his suspension or complaining about the monitoring. He mentioned his current project deadlines and asked if I'd learned anything interesting in history class. We discussed neutral topics for the full hour, without him making a single comment about my appearance or interests. The cautious coexistence felt realistic, rather than forced, like we were learning to be around each other without constant conflict. Leaving the building afterward, I felt okay about the visit, not excited or happy, but not dreading the next one either. Opening night arrived on a Friday in late October, and I stood backstage in my costume helping other ensemble members with last-minute adjustments. My phone buzzed with good luck texts from Mom and Haley and Tanner, sending a crew group chat message about pre-show energy. I pulled up Dad's contact and typed out a message with the program link and performance dates, not expecting him to come but giving him permission to watch if he wanted. I hit send before I could overthink it, and shoved my phone in my bag. The stage manager called places, and I moved to my starting position with the other ensemble members. Standing there in costume with people I'd worked alongside for weeks, I felt genuinely excited about performing something I chose. Whether Dad showed up in the audience or not didn't matter anymore. I was doing this for myself, and that was enough. That's the full rundown. I always try to sneak in something you can use in your own life, even in the smallest way. If this one gave you even a single useful thought, it's worth it. Subscribe so you'll always have the next one ready.